Chapter 6. The 100 Years' War, England and France. The 100 Years' War was a protracted conflict between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. The origins of this long and bloody conflict can be traced back to the dynastic rivalries and territorial disputes that emerged between the two kingdoms in the late Middle Ages. At the heart of the conflict was the question of the succession to the French throne. The last Capetian king of France, Charles IV, died in 1328 without a male heir. The succession then passed to his closest male relative, Philip VI, the first king of the Valois dynasty. This decision was challenged by Edward III of England, who was the son of Charles IV's sister, Isabella. Edward III argued that he had a legitimate claim to the French throne, based on his descent from the Capetian dynasty. His claim was further strengthened by the fact that he had been the vassal of Philip VI until 1337, when he refused to pay homage to the French king and instead declared himself the rightful king of France. In addition to the dynastic dispute, there were also significant territorial disputes between England and France. These centered on the possession of the Duchy of Aquitaine, which had been held by the English since the 12th century. The French king, however, maintained that Aquitaine was rightfully his, and sought to reassert his authority over the region. These territorial and dynastic disputes were exacerbated by a series of economic and social factors. Both France and England were experiencing economic hardship in the 14th century, and the burden of taxation fell heavily on the peasantry. This led to social unrest and popular uprisings, such as the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England. The origins of the 100 Years' War, therefore, can be seen as a complex interplay of political, economic, and social factors. The dynastic and territorial disputes between England and France were further complicated by broader economic and social trends that were affecting both countries. In the year 1346, a great battle was fought between the English and French armies near the small village of Crécy in northern France. It was a battle that would go down in history as one of the most important of the 100 Years' War, and one that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. The English army was led by King Edward III, who had invaded France in an attempt to claim the French crown for himself. His army was small, consisting of just 10,000 men, but it was highly trained and well-equipped. The French army, on the other hand, was much larger, numbering around 35,000 men, but it was poorly led and poorly equipped. The two armies met on the battlefield at Crécy, and what followed was a fierce and bloody battle that would last for several hours. The French knights charged the English lines, but were met with a withering hail of arrows from the English longbowmen. The French knights were no match for the deadly accuracy and range of the English longbows, and were cut down in droves. The battle raged on for hours, with the English forces holding their ground and repelling wave after wave of French attacks. In the end, the French army was decisively defeated, with thousands of men killed and many more captured. The English, on the other hand, suffered relatively few casualties, and were able to claim a great victory. The Battle of Crécy was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and it marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. The longbow had proved its worth as a deadly weapon, and would go on to become a staple of the English army for centuries to come. The battle also demonstrated the importance of discipline, training, and tactics in warfare, and paved the way for future military innovations. In the end, the Battle of Crécy was a triumph for the English and a devastating defeat for the French. It was a battle that would be remembered for centuries to come, and one that would shape the course of European history. During the 100 Years' War, the French port city of Calais became a crucial strategic location for both the French and the English. Its close proximity to England made it an ideal base for the English, while its location on the coast of the English Channel allowed the French to use it as a staging ground for their naval expeditions. In 1346, the English launched a massive invasion of France, culminating in the Battle of Crécy. In the aftermath of the battle, the English army marched towards Calais, intent on capturing the city. The siege of Calais began on September 4, 1346, and lasted for almost a year. The city was surrounded by a massive English army, which cut off all supplies to the city. The citizens of Calais were left with no choice but to surrender or face starvation. However, King Edward III of England was not content with a simple surrender. He demanded that 6 of the most prominent citizens of Calais present themselves to him, with nooses around their necks to be executed for their defiance. The mayor of Calais, Eustache de Saint-Pierre, along with 5 other citizens, bravely volunteered to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their city. They presented themselves to the English army, wearing simple robes and carrying the keys to the city. The English were so impressed by their bravery that Edward III spared their lives and ordered that they be treated with the utmost respect. The siege of Calais was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and the bravery of the citizens of Calais inspired others to stand up against their oppressors. The story of Eustache de Saint-Pierre and the other citizens who volunteered to sacrifice themselves became a legend, and was immortalized in art and literature for centuries to come. The Siege of Calais marked the beginning of a long and bloody conflict between England and France, which would last for over a century. It was a conflict that would shape the future of both nations and leave an indelible mark on the history of Europe. The bravery and sacrifice of the citizens of Calais would go down in history as an example of the power of the human spirit and a testament to the enduring legacy of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on September 19, 1356, was one of the most decisive battles of the 100 Years' War. The English army, led by King Edward III and his son the Black Prince, faced the French army, led by King John II of France. The French army outnumbered the English, but the English had an advantage in their use of the longbow. The English army had landed in Normandy in July and had marched south towards Bordeaux, where they hoped to establish a permanent foothold in France. The French had gathered a large army to intercept the English and had marched north to meet them. The two armies met near the town of Poitiers, in central France. The French army was heavily armored and included many knights on horseback. They had planned to use their superior numbers to overwhelm the English. The English, on the other hand, had a smaller force, but they were highly trained and well equipped. They were armed with the longbow, which could shoot farther and faster than the French crossbow. The battle began with a charge by the French knights, who were met by a hail of arrows from the English archers. The French knights were bogged down by the muddy terrain and were unable to charge effectively. Meanwhile, the English were able to move around and flank the French. The French suffered heavy losses, and King John was captured by the English. The battle was a devastating defeat for the French, and it led to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which ended the first phase of the 100 Years' War. The Battle of Poitiers was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, and it demonstrated the power of the English longbow. The battle also marked the beginning of the decline of the French knightly class, which had dominated European warfare for centuries. The English victory at Poitiers paved the way for further English victories in the 100 Years' War, and it helped to establish England as a major power in Europe. In the mid-14th century, France was rocked by a series of violent uprisings and social unrest, known as the Jacquerie. The movement took its name from the common nickname for French peasants, Jacques Bonhomme, and was driven by a deep sense of frustration and anger among the lower classes. The immediate cause of the Jacquerie was the devastation wrought by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, which had left many peasants struggling to survive. The war had ravaged the French countryside, causing widespread destruction and displacement, while the plague had killed off up to a third of the population. In the face of these challenges, many peasants turned to banditry, raiding the estates of the nobility in search of food and other resources. The Jacquerie began in May 1358, when a group of peasants from the Beauvais region of northern France rose up against their lords. The revolt quickly spread to other parts of the country, as bands of peasants attacked castles, burned manor houses, and murdered aristocrats and their families. The rebels were led by a variety of charismatic figures, including Guillaume Caille, who claimed to be a prophet sent by God to liberate the poor. The nobility responded to the Jacquerie with brutal force, launching a vicious campaign of repression and punishment. In many cases, the rebels were simply massacred or hunted down by armed knights and soldiers. However, the uprising had a lasting impact on French society, contributing to a sense of social and political unrest that would eventually culminate in the French Revolution. Today, the Jacquerie is remembered as a powerful symbol of the struggle between the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, and the ways in which these tensions can erupt into open conflict. While the revolt was ultimately unsuccessful in its aims, it represented a turning point in the history of France and the struggle for social justice. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been raging for decades, with both sides winning battles and suffering defeats. However, in 1428, a young peasant girl from Domremy named Joan of Arc entered the scene and turned the tide of the war in favor of the French. Joan believed she had been sent by God to drive the English out of France and to lead the French to victory. Her unshakable faith, charisma, and military tactics inspired the French soldiers and commanders. One of the most significant battles in which Joan participated was the Siege of Orléans, a strategic city on the Loire River in the Loire Valley. The city had been under siege by the English for months, and the French troops were exhausted and demoralized. However, with the arrival of Joan, the French army was reinvigorated, and morale was boosted. Joan quickly took charge of the French troops and inspired them to fight bravely. She led the troops into battle, carrying a banner depicting the image of the Virgin Mary. Her presence on the battlefield was a significant morale booster for the French soldiers. Joan also worked to lift the siege of the city by planning and leading successful sorties against the English forces. The turning point in the siege came on May 8, 1429, when Joan led a surprise attack on the English forts that surrounded Orléans. The attack was a success, and the English were forced to retreat. With the retreat of the English, the siege was lifted, and the city was saved. The Battle of Orléans was a significant turning point in the 100 Years' War. The French had suffered a series of defeats at the hands of the English, and the siege of Orléans was seen as the last hope for the French resistance. The victory at Orléans, led by Joan of Arc, was a morale booster for the French, who went on to win several more battles and ultimately win the war. Joan's military tactics, bravery, and charisma were critical in the French victory at the Siege of Orléans. Her accomplishments were not only significant in the war, but also played a significant role in changing the position of women in medieval society. Joan of Arc was eventually captured by the English and burned at the stake for heresy, but her legacy lives on. The 100 Years' War was one of the most significant conflicts of the medieval period. It was a series of intermittent wars fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453. The war was characterized by long periods of truce and short bursts of fighting, and it had a profound impact on both nations. The war was fought over a variety of issues, including territorial disputes, dynastic claims, and economic interests. One of the most significant battles of the 100 Years' War was the Battle of Castellane, which took place on July 17, 1453. The battle marked the end of the war, which had lasted for more than a century. The battle was fought between the French and English forces, with the French emerging victorious. The English forces, led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, had been campaigning in the region of Gascony, which was under English control. The French forces, under the command of Charles VII, had been attempting to recapture the region. The two armies met near the town of Castellane, and a fierce battle ensued. The French forces had a significant advantage in terms of numbers, and they also had a more modern and effective artillery. The English forces were unable to withstand the French artillery barrage, and they suffered heavy losses. John Talbot was killed in the battle, which was a significant blow to the English forces. The Battle of Castellane was the last major battle of the 100 Years' War. The war had been devastating for both England and France, and it had left both countries exhausted and in debt. The war had also led to significant changes in military tactics and technology. The use of the longbow, which had been the weapon of choice for the English forces, was gradually phased out in favor of artillery and other firearms. The legacy of the 100 Years' War was profound. The war had cemented the idea of the nation-state and had created a sense of national identity in both England and France. It had also contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of centralized monarchies. The war had also had a significant impact on the development of the English language, with many French words and phrases entering the English lexicon. In conclusion, the Battle of Castellane was a significant moment in the history of the 100 Years' War. It marked the end of a long and devastating conflict, and paved the way for significant changes in military tactics and technology. The legacy of the war was profound, and it had a significant impact on the development of England and France, as well as on the development of European society as a whole. In the early 15th century, England and France were locked in a bitter struggle for power known as the 100 Years' War. The conflict had been raging on and off since the mid-14th century, and by the time of Henry V's ascension to the English throne in 1413, both sides were eager for a final resolution. Despite some early successes, the English were facing mounting challenges as they struggled to maintain their position in France. One of the key turning points in the 100 Years' War came in 1420, with the signing of the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty, which was negotiated by Henry V and his advisors, was intended to bring an end to the conflict by establishing a new joint English-French monarchy. Under the terms of the treaty, Henry V was recognized as the heir to the French throne and was betrothed to Catherine, the daughter of the French King Charles VI. When Charles died a few years later, Henry and Catherine's infant son was recognized as the king of both England and France. At first it appeared that the Treaty of Troyes had brought an end to the 100 Years' War, and that England had emerged as the dominant power in France. However, the situation soon deteriorated. Many French nobles were unhappy with the terms of the treaty and continued to fight against the English. Meanwhile, Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving his infant son as the king of both England and France. The new English king, Henry VI, was too young to rule, and his advisors struggled to maintain control over the French territories that had been won by his father. In 1429, the French forces, led by the teenage Joan of Arc, won a decisive victory at the Siege of Orleans. This victory marked a turning point in the war, and within a few years the English had been driven out of France entirely. The Treaty of Troyes, which had once seemed like a triumph for the English, was ultimately a failure. Despite the efforts of Henry V and his advisors, they were unable to establish a lasting English presence in France, and the 100 Years' War continued for several more decades. However, the treaty did have significant consequences for the English monarchy. By establishing a new joint monarchy with France, the treaty laid the groundwork for centuries of conflict and rivalry between the two nations, even as it brought an end to one of the most protracted and bitter wars in European history. The 100 Years' War between England and France was one of the most significant conflicts of the Middle Ages. It was a long and brutal struggle that lasted from 1337 to 1453, and involved a series of battles, sieges, and skirmishes on both land and sea. One of the key factors that helped the English to emerge victorious in the war was the rise of the English Navy, which played a critical role in securing English control of the Channel and the surrounding seas. The English Navy began to emerge as a powerful force in the late 14th century, during the reign of King Richard II. At this time, the English Channel was a crucial route for trade and commerce between England and the rest of Europe, and control of the sea was essential for maintaining the English economy and supporting the war effort against France. The English Navy was therefore tasked with protecting English shipping, intercepting enemy vessels, and supporting the movement of English troops and supplies across the Channel. One of the key innovations that helped to make the English Navy so successful was the use of longbows and other missile weapons, which gave English ships a distinct advantage in ranged combat. English ships were also designed with a low profile and a narrow beam, which made them faster and more maneuverable than their French counterparts. In addition, the English Navy was highly disciplined and well-trained, with a system of ranks and a strict code of conduct that helped to maintain order and discipline on board. Despite the many successes of the English Navy, it was not invincible, and the French were able to mount several successful naval campaigns against the English. In particular, the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372 was a major setback for the English Navy, as it marked the first time that a French fleet had defeated an English fleet in open water. However, the English were able to recover from this defeat and rebuild their naval strength, thanks in part to the support of wealthy merchants and other private investors who saw the value of a strong English navy for trade and commerce. By the end of the 100 Years' War, the English Navy had established itself as one of the most powerful naval forces in Europe. Its successes in the war helped to cement England's position as a major European power, and its innovations in naval warfare would continue to influence the development of naval strategy and tactics for centuries to come. The legacy of the English Navy would be felt not only in England, but throughout the world, as English naval power helped shape the course of global history. The 100 Years' War was a seminal period in the history of both England and France, lasting from 1337 to 1453. Over the course of this conflict, the two nations engaged in a series of bloody battles and sieges, vying for control of territories in northern France. The war was marked by many important events and figures, from the Black Death to Joan of Arc, and had a profound impact on the course of European history. The war began as a result of disputes over the succession to the French throne, which had been left in question after the death of Charles IV. When Edward III of England, who was Charles's nephew, made a claim to the French crown, it sparked a conflict that would last for more than a century. The early years of the war saw English victories at Crécy and Poitiers, but the tide began to turn in the late 14th century, as the French were able to mount a successful resistance against English advances. One of the most important turning points in the war was the Siege of Orleans, which took place in 1429. At this time, the French army was struggling to resist English advances, and the English seemed poised to take control of much of France. However, a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc emerged, claiming to have been sent by God to save France. She rallied the French troops and led them to a decisive victory at Orleans, which was the first step in a series of victories that would eventually lead to the end of the war. The final battle of the 100 Years' War was fought at Castillon in 1453, and resulted in a decisive French victory. This battle marked the end of an era, as England lost control of its territories in northern France and was forced to refocus its energies on domestic affairs. The war had been incredibly costly for both sides, and had left a deep scar on the psyche of the nations involved. The 100 Years' War had a profound impact on the course of European history, in terms of both military strategy and national identity. The war was characterized by the emergence of new technologies and tactics, such as the longbow and the cannon, which would go on to shape the way wars were fought in Europe for centuries to come. Additionally, the war played a major role in the development of national identities in both England and France, as the two nations engaged in a bitter struggle for dominance. In England, the 100 Years' War became a symbol of national pride and strength, and was seen as a defining moment in the country's history. It also helped to establish the importance of the English Navy, which played a key role in many of the war's most important battles. In France, the war was seen as a period of hardship and suffering, but also as a moment of national resilience and unity. The legacy of the war can still be seen in the present day, as it helped to shape the national identities and military strategies of both countries for centuries to come.